Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And today we are looking at S.O.E. and resistance activities in Denmark. My guest lectures, writes about military history with a focus on special operations. And this is part of our ongoing look at both Denmark and Norway. We've got another week coming later in August. I think there'll be another one in November as I keep finding more historians, which is fantastic. But welcome to World War II TV. Martin, how are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
So I always like to ask a new guest how you define yourself. Some people are very rigid, that they're storytellers, they're researchers, they're just classic historians. Do you have a particular label you like to give yourself?
I think I'm a bit of both, or maybe all three. I am a professional historian. That is, I teach history to people a bit younger than myself. But I'm also as you say, lecturer, and I specialize in World War I, World War II. So I think my ambition is to bring these stories to a wide audience. I'm not a researcher, or I'm not that professional historian as being a university historian.
Thank you. And I like the fact on your website you say philosophy as well, because the more I study this subject, the dates and things are interesting. That's the context, but it's the whys. It's the why do human beings do this? Why do people make decisions in times of great trauma? And so I think the philosophical angle, that's what keeps me up at wake, is that, you know, for example, I don't know, how can an SS officer kiss his children on the forehead, go across the road to the death camp and oversee the murder of millions, and then go back to his kids and play toy trains on the floors? That's the kind of question. And as will be discussed today, what would I do if I was living in a country that was occupied by an enemy? You know, how would I respond? Which is a real great segue into the fact you've got your slides here. So folks, what we'll do today is we'll do any big kind of how is World War II taught in Denmark questions at the end of the show, but ones pertaining to what Martin is talking about, we'll kind of deal with them as we're going along. And I think we'll just hand over to our guests to learn about this, because it's a subject I don't know a huge amount about, which is why we bring guests on who do. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. And well, I think it's safe to say that when we talk about resistance and the S.O.E. in Denmark, it's a bit of a slow start on this story, because from the beginning, Denmark had a let's say quite unique experience, and I'll come back to it. But I hope most of the viewers know that Denmark had a policy of neutrality long before World War I, and then during the interwar years as well. So when war again threatened, Danish politicians and the greater part of the Danish population was very keen on avoiding being dragged into a war with Germany or the other great powers in Europe. But before we enter that part of the story, I would like to just take a minute and Paul, you said the philosophical point is also a good one, and history also have great deal of philosophy in it, because big history like World War II, and it's a phenomenon full of small stories, and the resistance in Denmark is of course part of a big history, namely how the British especially try to find a way to attack Hitler's grip on Europe after the catastrophes of 1940. So that's the big history we have to remember. But in Denmark, you also have this this flood of small stories. And oh, sorry, my plant just rolled over. So this part of the story, this focus on the smaller things and the small beginnings, I think is very important to bear in mind. This is, of course, not unique for Denmark. It's the same story everywhere. But the point here is that Denmark is quite late to the game when it comes to organized resistance. So bear that in mind, please. But if we'll start when Denmark was occupied by the Germans, and the fateful date of the 9th of April 1940. is a date of infamy in Danish history, as well of course in Norwegian history. But in Danish history, this is a controversial date because the Danish government and the main political parties quickly decided during the morning of the 9th of April that any form of military resistance was futile, and Denmark had to accept this occupation under protest, of course. But the main focus for the Danish government and for many people in Denmark was to keep society intact, to avoid war, and to maybe accommodate the occupiers in a way where they did not disturb the way society worked. And I think this experience was one that shocked many Danes, and it may have laid the foundation for the later resistance or the later resistance movement. But in the early days of the occupation, many Danes reacted with shock that the Germans had occupied Denmark, and of course the news from Norway where things were a bit different. There were actual war in Norway, and nobody could be in any doubt that Norway was being attacked, the king has fled, and so on. In Denmark, the king stayed, the government functioned, the police were still in the street, Danish police, some part of the Danish military was still under arms. And in so many ways, Denmark was, yes, occupied, but Denmark was still a society which worked as usual. So neutrality and the policy of staying out of trouble, if you can call that, was still something you saw in everyday life. And this part of the first phase of the occupation in Denmark is one which is, well, maybe one of the most controversial subjects to this day, because we see that the Danish government, you see the Prime Minister Stauning and the German, the head of the German Foreign Office in Denmark at that time, and I think in this picture, they and the other main political party agreed on this policy of neutrality, of collaboration, and it lasted for maybe 3 years as such. Of course, there were, during 1942 and 1943, more and more problems with this policy because a larger part of the population began to show criticism, but still the Danish state and especially the Danish police, well, large part of it, were a bit keen on holding on to this policy of collaboration. And I think we must remember that Denmark came out, I know I'll fast forward a bit here, but Denmark came out of World War II relatively unscattered. There were no widespread destruction. There were a rather limited loss of life, and the Germans behaved very, very good in Denmark, if you could say that. There were, of course, repression and torture for some resistors, and there were, for the greater part of the population instances where they were very fearful. But when you compare to other occupied countries in Europe, Poland and other Eastern European countries are, of course, extreme examples. But Norway, Belgium, and France have, the Netherlands as well, have a more violent history and a more repressive German regime. So this policy of collaboration was in many ways, some would argue, a necessity, and the Danish political parties and the Danish government did their best to keep society intact, to protect the Danish population from a world war going on all around them. And this... We
had a question from Andreas.
Yes, of course.
Did the war service of some Danes, so from the Jutland area, sort of ethnically Germans, in the German army in the First World War, play a decision in the decision to stay neutral?
Well, I think the main trauma in Danish political decision making was the the spectre of, as you say, World War One, but also the defeat to Prussia in 1864, when Denmark lost quite a bit of territory to Prussia/Germany. So this was the real trauma. But of course, the way some Danes, they were Germans then, that became Danes then, after 1920, the way the experiences they had on the Western Front was, I think, instrumental to opening the eyes for many Danes to the horror of modern war. So I think it's a good point that nobody was in any doubt how destructive war was and how traumatic it was for those who took part in it. And for many Danes, the ability to stay neutral in World War One was actually something of a scoop. Yeah. So I think I think we should consider the collective experience in Denmark during the interwar years was one of relief of having stayed out of this Great War, and one of course where the experience of some Danes from the northern part of Germany, the southern part of Denmark, played a part in forming this experience. So
thank you.
But I think going back to this this start, where Denmark was neutral but under occupation by German forces, it was also a time when Denmark, and especially the official Denmark, had a very, very hard time of persuading Great Britain, France, and other allied countries that Denmark actually was occupied, because we hadn't fired a shot. There weren't any greater destruction in Denmark when the Germans came, and we were collaborating with the Germans, and society functioned. And this was also, as you will see, something which troubled many Danes, and of course was a motivating factor, I think, for those Danes who went into resistance during 1941-42, but especially those Danes who found themselves out of Denmark when the Germans came, and who saw their country occupied and saw that their government did nothing. And these men and women, they decided to seek or offer their services to the British Armed Forces. And I know, Paul, you covered one of maybe the most famous, Anders Lassen, the Danish Special Forces operator. But many of these Danes at first had trouble because British authorities were a bit, how could I say, suspicious about what was the Danish sympathies in this conflict. But some of them had the luck to be enrolled in the armed forces, and some of them became S.O.E operators. And we will meet them later, but it's just to make a point of the most of the S.O.E operators who came into Denmark during the later war years was not in Denmark when the occupation started. And this is also a bit of a difference if you compare to Norway, where a great many Norwegians came to Great Britain after the Germans overran Norway in June of 1940. And there were also, of course, ways of getting from occupied Norway to Great Britain that did not exist in Denmark. So the let's call it human resources of the S.O.E, that pool of Danes were quite little to a point where the S.O.E had to, they weren't sure they could operate effectively in Denmark. Things luckily changed, but we first in 1941, 1942. But the main point I like to underline is that the larger part of the Danish population went to this occupation with what one can call a form of passive acceptance and unwilling compliance. There were a great deal of, how can I say, low-key resistance in the fact that many Danes did not do what the government wanted them to do, that is, be polite to the Germans when they met them on the streets. So all these symbolic acts showed that the Danish population as a whole were quite patriotic and had a view on that the Germans were in fact occupying their country against their will. But of course, these signals, if we roll it back into the context of the World War, nobody sees them in the, let's say, high summer of 1940 when the German panzer divisions are rolling across northern France, or when the Germans are waging war in the skies over Britain. So Denmark the official Denmark has a hard time persuading anyone, including himself, I think, that Denmark treads this line of cooperation, but we accepted the German occupation on the protest.
Yeah.
I think
we talked about this before going live, Martin, and people who watch the channel or not will know exactly what I'm going to say next. And it's my reference to Dr. Chris Millington's understanding of the terms resistance and collaboration, where he prefers defiance and accommodation, because what you're saying is essentially the Danes take on this situation where they're sort of accepting, but also the situation, but also being defiant while they can, just trying to be a bit, difficult with the Germans and make their life more frustrating as an occupied nation, but not necessarily going out on a Tuesday evening after work and blowing up a train and then hiding in the forest with your friends, which, as it always comes down to in these discussions, there's only the ability to have resistance, really, if you have somewhere to A, train resistance, B, arm resistance, and hide them when you've done something against the occupier. And Denmark's not a very big place. And so these are the parameters that you have to consider when you're comparing Denmark with perhaps Yugoslavia or Burma, where you've got, thousands of square miles of nothing. But
geography in Denmark does not lend itself to larger resistance movement. That is a clear point. And I think defiance, or low-key defiance, in the first part of the war is a good way to describe how many Danes acted when they met the Germans. But we should also remember that many German soldiers viewed their stationing in Denmark as a happy experience. They were safe, and they thought the country was well organized, the people friendly, and they were quite close to home. So many Germans saw this. I don't know if you could call it a front. That would be a bit harsh. There weren't any fighting in Denmark. So stationing in Denmark was something a lot of Germans dreamt about. But the thing to remember, if we move on, is that from a German perspective, the policy of collaboration which the Danish government had put in place after the 9th of April 1940 was also a good chance for the Germans to send a wider signal to the rest of occupied Europe that German occupation could work, and German occupation actually was something which served both parties. Remember that when the Germans came, they explained that they came to Denmark to protect Denmark from the British. And they also developed this idea from a military standpoint they tried to develop this idea to a more political version, where the Danish population, and especially Danish industry and agriculture, served a great purpose in the wider design of a German war machine. And another point was that this policy of collaboration, it also led to instances where Danish Nazis, as you see in the pictures, these are young Danes who have volunteered for the Waffen-SS, and they are being shipped out for training. We are in, I think, 1941. And we're not talking about a lot of people during the whole of the war. I think 6,000 total. Many of them came from the Danish minority in the south of Denmark. And it should be stressed that the larger Danish population felt that these men were traitors, and there were lots of jealousy, and the relationships between the population and these men were quite cold when they were back in Denmark on leave. So the wider population see these men as a problem, but the Danish government, because we follow this policy of collaboration, is forced to accept and to try to get recruits into this volunteer force. So again, thorny issue, a controversial one, even today in Denmark, where descendants of these men who fought primarily on the Eastern Front try to argue that the Danish government wanted them to volunteer, but a lot of Danes then and now feel that these men, well, they fought for the ultimate evil, the Waffen-SS and the Nazi state. But from a German point of view, during these years, the start years of the occupation, we're talking 1940, 1941, 1942, they saw this force, the Frikorps Denmark, the Freikorps Denmark, or other instances of Danes collaborating with the Germans as a symbol of this model protectorate, which they hoped, the German diplomats and foreign office officials, that other occupied states could in some way model or be inspired on. This was, of course, not a very successful ambition, but one that they thought Denmark could be a model for. So again, one of those instances where Danish history becomes, well, not black or white, but maybe gray. Yes. Moving on, I think it's time to introduce, well, the S.O.E, the Special Operations Executive. And I know that a lot of viewers know this organization already, but to those who just need a bit of, quickly to know what it is, well, during the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill put the phrase, set Europe ablaze. And this famous phrase, well, it's very Churchillian, was maybe to inspire and to help organize resistance grow in the occupied Europe. And I think we must remember the S.O.E was in some way already an established fact before the catastrophe of 1940, but it became an instrument of, or a military instrument, after, as you see, the catastrophe and the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. So Britain stood alone, and Britain was in no way able to fight the German war machine. So how to challenge German hold on Europe? Well, you organize, you support a army of resistors in the occupied countries, and S.O.E became the instrument. So in this regard, S.O.E activities must of course be seen as a worldwide ambition for the British authorities. But in a Danish context, as I said a bit earlier, the British were a bit hard pressed to find Danes who could operate in Denmark, because we had this, as I said, policy of collaboration, and because, as you said, Paul, Denmark was not a place where you could, cultivate a working resistant movement because of our geography and so forth. But in a let's say, when times are tough, you need to do what you can. And the S.O.E did find Danes willing to undergo this training as a special forces operator, and they were also fortunate that during 1940, 1942, there were a bit of resistance in Denmark. We were talking very low-key resistance. A good example are the boys in the picture here, the Churchill Club. They're actually high school youths who were, like you said, Paul, not as much resistance fighters as people who were defiant of the Germans. Yeah. So they burned German flags, or maybe wrote some anti-German slogans on the walls. I don't think Hitler's war machine shivered, but it were instances of resistance. And these acts, I think, encourage the British authorities to engage in this, let's say, early attempts of pushing S.O.E., that is Danish-speaking Danes trained as S.O.E. operators on Danish soil. And the point is, or the ambition is, to organize resistance, to get radio operators in so they could contact London, and you could paradrop supplies and arms into local resistance groups. It is as I say, it's a slow start, because the Danish population as a whole is in a very passive state, but Danish police as a whole is very active and very good at tracking down the S.O.E. operators. You see the picture here. A Danish policeman he wears the parachute dress, and you see the S.O.E. supplies and such, which they have found the morning after a paradrop. So S.O.E. has a hard time establishing itself in Denmark. And this is, of course, another point we must remember. The S.O.E. never operated in a vacuum. They needed local resistance to hide them, to cooperate. And in our instances, in this example, in Denmark, during 1940, 1943, there weren't that many active resistance groups, and there were not many capable of cooperating with the British authorities.
But you can make the point, Martin, that a slow start to Denmark's resistance was maybe a better way of doing it than, for example, France, where France had to kind of rebuild its resistance network about 3 or 4 times, because all the 1940 resistors, the army got killed or captured or taken to Germany. Mm-hmm. Then the first rounds of resistance units get captured and caught, and the Germans infiltrate them. And so by the time you get to 1944, they're on their like 7th or 8th incarnation of a movement. So you could maybe say that the expression that comes to mind is, keep your powder dry. Yeah. Just start something solidly but small and allow it to naturally grow as the war goes. I'm not saying France did it wrong. I'm just saying there are different ways of going about it, and maybe a steady, sensible approach. Yeah, might have been the best one.
I think that's a good point. I think in the terms of the Danish experience during World War II, there weren't many alternatives, because the Danish resistance movement was not actually existing before 1942 onwards. Yeah. And as you say, it would be wiser to have a more powerful resistance movement who could challenge the Germans or be an active force in the transition from war to peace. But if we think about how the war and the hostilities were in the years of 1940, 1942, not many people thought that the Germans would lose. So there is this this fear that the Allies would be on the losing side, and the Danish are cooperating with the Germans. And far into 1941, 1942, it seems that if the Axis powers are in a position where they can hold their own against the British and Allies. So, but you are right. I think your question is also a good one, because it touches upon how we today think about the resistance movement, and if their timing was a good one. And maybe we could come back to it. But I would like just to say that in the Danish historiography, the way we historians think about resistance in Denmark during the war, there are, let's say, 2 schools of thought. The consensus school stressed that the Danish population as a whole were resisting or were defiant, and the larger resistant, more violent movement from 1943 onwards was just a manifestation of this will to resist, whereas the more peaceful but defiant in 1940, 1941 was because people were afraid or couldn't do anything because they hadn't been armed yet. And another school, I think we can call the conflict school, stresses that the reasons why the Danish resistance movement was did take a while in manifesting itself was that the resistance movement was not one, it was well, two or more, and it was split down between segments of society: the middle class, the working class, the bourgeoisie, the communists, and those different versions of what society, which model Denmark should be after the war, was a more important question for many of these resistance fighters than actually fighting the Germans. And again, this is, I won't take sides in this debate. It is a debate which has been going on for decades, and it's, I think, very interesting, but also one where the fronts sometimes are very, you know, that it's hard to see each other's arguments. But the point is, during the same, I think, goes also on in France, and so when you're talking about the resistance and the communist part of it. But if we go back to it, during this period of the war, the Danish government, Danish police, very actively combating resistance and appealing to the populace to not aid the resistance, and the S.O.E. have a very hard time in establishing itself on Danish soil. It doesn't help that when it comes to the active, when they actively try to insert parachute people into Denmark, it also goes very wrong. So just to see these three faces, there are symbols of the hardships that the S.O.E. had during this period. In 1942, these three operators were parachuted in, and as you can see, one of them shot and killed by Danish police, the other killed when his parachute didn't work, and the last one had to take poison because the Germans found him when he was transmitting with his radio. So operating in Denmark was difficult for the S.O.E. just because of bad luck, but also because the Danish police were, because of the Danish government, very actively involved in tracking down these men, and the Danish police invested a great deal of resources, because the Danish government knew if we don't collaborate, and if we don't hunt down the S.O.E. or other resistance, then the Germans will take over, or will maybe be forced to use a harder hand in combating these men. But until 1942, just to sum up, the S.O.E. is in a minimal position in Denmark, and the resistance as a whole is focused on local groups who are engaged in what I think is best described as symbolic resistance. So up to this point, Denmark has been spared the hostilities or greater acts of war. So the war is something which is going on all around Denmark, but not in Denmark. And I think the main point I would like to convey to explain how and why this changes is because the war changes. And again, your listeners, Paul, they know everything about this, so we won't get into detail. But the great turning of the tide from 1942, the winter of 1942, the spring of 1943 onwards, is very important in explaining why a larger part of the Danish population first begin to criticize this policy of cooperation, and then begin actively to support resistance movement or resistors. And that is also something that gives the S.O.E. its final break to break through to Danish society. And these pictures I've chosen, the Axis forces surrendering in Tunisia, forces surrendering in Stalingrad, and of course the German setback at Kursk, and then Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, all these big events, this are example of, well, let's call it big history, but they translate into small stories in Denmark.
It basically gives people confidence. Yeah, across occupied Europe, if you feel that the tide of war is changing on the battlefield, it gives you a little bit more confidence for you and your friends to start thinking about, as you say, what you can do in your little way. Because, you know, Operation Torch is a very big thing. You know, Stalingrad is a big thing, but you and your friends in your small Danish town, maybe now you could do something that will have an effect. So, yeah, it's understandable that there's a change of attitude. I think it happens in the other countries as well. So, brilliant point. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Western Europe awakens to the fact that Germany is losing the war. And the BBC and other clandestine news services are also very busy in telling the Danish population that these things are happening. So there is a change of in the way you view Germany, and this, of course, leads to the first and I think most important breakdown between Danish and German authorities, namely the events of August 1943. When the collaboration policy breaks down. And from then to the day of the liberation in May 1945, you have a progressively worse relationship between the larger Danish population and the German occupying forces. That is not to say, and I must stress this, that the ordinary Dane felt frightened or experienced random acts of violence. Some people did, especially in the big cities. But the larger part of the population experienced rationing and, you know, other limiting factors in their daily lives. But none, of course, experienced what some Norwegians, some Dutch people, many people in the North of France, and extremely many Polish people did, namely direct military hostilities or a very heavy-handed repression from German forces. This did not happen, but in a Danish context, this is a change because the population begins to be very critical of the collaboration policy, and this is the main point. The policy of collaboration breaks down in 1943, August 1943, and from then on, it is Danish officials who are collaborating with the German officials to keep society going in some way. But the main political parties and the government steps back. And from then on, institutions within the Danish state, the army, the police are progressively banned or rolled back by the German. The army is disarmed also in August 1943. And this also, of course, gives the resistance more support and more recruits. And it is a stroke of luck for the S.O.E. because the S.O.E. In the months before these events has succeeded in inserting itself in Denmark with a handful of operators. So they got to be a guiding hand in this surge of resistance. I'll come back to the point later, but I think it's fair to say that it's also a question about which individuals the S.O.E. decided to insert into Denmark. This man, I think, is one of the most important S.O.E. operators during the war in Denmark, Flemming Mus. He is also one who is a bit controversial. After the war, he spent time in prison because people thought or accused him of embezzlement. And he led a quite a charmed life in during the occupation. But he was also one who was blessed with a very good or large organizational talent. And the fact that he was parachuted in gave the resistance a new driving force. And he was also very good at organizing, or how should I put it, putting together local resistance forces with the guiding hand of the S.O.E. Because you must remember, the S.O.E. was a military organization. It was centered on the British Foreign Office, British interest, of course. And in the first war years, S.O.E., as I said before, had this primary objective of disrupting German occupational forces in occupied Europe. But from 1943 onwards, S.O.E. also becomes a force of preparing for the return of Allied armies to occupied Europe. And Muse here has this ambition as well. So there are, let's say, two tasks he has to perform. One is to organize and arm the Danish resistance, so it becomes some sort of force on its own, which can offer resistance to the Germans, not take control of Danish territory, but as you said, sabotage railroads and all that. But the other form is to engage in the organization of a underground army. And this ambition grows during 1944. But an underground army is a instrument if and when the Allied armies make or try to invade the Danish territory. Of course, we know now that this was not an ambition the Allies had, but it was, of course, part of a larger, let's say, ambition to confuse the Germans, and also, of course, to make the Germans invest more resources in controlling occupied Europe. But this man is a very important individual, and he is also lucky because he has he's followed by another gifted man. I will come back to him later. But their ambition, just to make clear for the viewers, ambition is, if you would take the map on the right first, that is to make this military impact from the Danish resistance. And how do you make a military impact? Well, you destroy as much as you can the railroads connecting the Danish cities, but most of all the Danish harbors, because the Danish harbors, a large town like Aarhus or Frederikshavn, are harbors which the Germans are using to communicate and control the Norway, their garrison in Norway. So it's quite important for the Allies to get local Danish resistance to disrupt these modes of communication. But the other map, I think, it's a good example of how resistance was being organized into different parts of the country, different groups with different responsibilities, but each of these groups was also an example of a part of this underground army, as I told you before. And we now know, but then I think it was more of a shot in the dark. But the British Foreign Ministry also had an ambition of getting the S.O.E. to organize these underground armies as a instrument of securing Danish political control and British, of course, sphere of interest after the war. So when the German occupying forces left, or when the German occupation collapsed, there was some kind of armed force which could control the Danish territory, and you maybe control and upheld law and order, but of course also how can I put it? Reject any form of communist or power attempt to take power in Denmark. Right. This is not an actual fear, but if you compare to Greece, where there is a civil war, and during the last stage of the Second World War, it is something that the S.O.E. has to think about. And there is, I must stress, a powerful part of the Danish resistance which has its base in the working class and Communist Party. But at this point, they are fully integrated in the larger resistance and collaborating with the S.O.E., although sometimes the communists think that they don't get as much weapons as the more middle-class resistors does, but that's an argument running to today. But this is what S.O.E. begins to organize in Denmark. I said before that the man Flemming Muse was lucky that he had another associate who could, let's say, follow up on what Muse had in mind. And this man is Otto Geisler. And as you see, he's a man who was primarily working in Jutland. For the viewers not so well versed in Danish geography, let's go one back. Jutland is the large island where you can see Aarhus and so on. And this man was parachuted in 1943, and he immediately began organizing local resistance groups, not as groups to actually do, acts of sabotage against the Germans, but more as groups which specialized in being at the right place at the right time when the RAF paradrop supplies. And he was very lucky because he came into contact with a group not far from where I'm sitting, a group in just outside a town called Randers. It's a smaller town in Jutland, and this group was constituted of local people, one of them a tavern owner, blacksmith, and so on, called Hvidsten Gruppen. And this group is quite important or quite famous in the history of the resistance in Denmark, but also linked to the S.O.E. Geisler, as you know, was S.O.E., and he needed someone to help him when the RAF dropped supplies, to take these supplies from the drop zone and hide them from the Germans if the Germans came searching for them, and of course distribute them to other resistance groups so they could use these weapons and munitions in active acts of sabotage. And he was very good and very lucky because he found these men and women in the Hvidsten Gruppe who very quickly became one of the most important groups in doing this work. And they were active in 1943 and the start of 1944. And a great deal of munitions were dropped at this point called Husted Point. The RAF called it one of the best drop zones in Denmark in this period. And they distributed, as I said, arms to other groups, and this gave a surge in sabotage activities in the late spring, the summer of 1943, which I hope accidentally you can see also was when the German or the Axis fell short of, everywhere on the battlefield you looked, Axis were in retreat or at a standstill. So it was very fortunate for the S.O.E. that they had integrated themselves, built a network, and could distribute arms at this point in the war. Unfortunately, just to prove the point that this was dangerous work, the Hvidsten Gruppe was unraveled by the Germans. A couple of the S.O.E. agents, which also was paradropped on the Mustad drop zone, was arrested, and they under torture or under the threat of torture talked about the Hvidsten Gruppe, and then the group was arrested and unfortunately in the summer of 1944 executed. And this is one of the, I think, also small stories which gives way to the big history, because in Denmark, maybe because of the fact there was a film about this group a couple of years ago, many people know about these men and women who were with the Hvidsten Gruppe, and many admire these people for their courage and their sacrifice. But it's, I think, also a romantic but a bit of a tragic story, because these people helped the S.O.E. and they lived more or less on the drop zone, and they gave their heart and soul to these S.O.E. operatives. But when the Germans began unraveling the network they were part of, they did not go to ground or hit themselves. They stayed where they were and were arrested by the Gestapo. And as I said, many of them subsequently executed a bit later. And one could ask why these men and women from this resistance group didn't, when they heard that the network was being unraveled, didn't try to get to Sweden or something like that. And I think there's the tragic and the romantic part in it, but also I think a point worth remembering, that many Danes, although accustomed to the occupation and knowing that people got arrested and tortured and sent away, some of them to Germany, and the odd one got executed, there was still this, I think, idea that the Germans were acting civilized, which I think must stress in a wider context they actually were. But in a Danish context, the gloves were off from 1943 onwards.
Yeah.
And maybe we can make a bit of a point of that the Danish population as a whole still believed in the dignity of man during this period of the war, whereas the German philosophy of empire in 1944 or before that was one of divide and conquer, and if you won't follow or accommodate us, then you must feel the brunt force of repression. And in 1944, all odds are against Germany, and of course, this is what these saboteurs then, or resistors then feel. And there is much more to the story, but I think we have to move on. But it's just an example of one of the more successful, but also romantic and a bit tragic small histories, which resistance in Denmark, and of course many occupied European countries, is so rich on. But one of the more famous interlocking histories between the wider war, the resistance in Denmark, and S.O.E. activities is the two, maybe three, but two air attacks which the RAF made on Danish territory. So the context is that the Danish resistance in 1943-1944 was in the defensive, because the Gestapo, the Abwehr, the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst were able to unravel a great part of the resistance movement because they had access to informers and they had arrested, as I said, S.O.E. operatives and others. And that made the Danish resistance, with the help from the S.O.E., call on their RAF to conduct a couple of raids to, disrupt Gestapo activity. And as you see in this picture, mosquitoes are flying in, bombing dormitories at the Aarhus University in 1944. And I know, Paul, you've covered these attacks in another episode, so I won't be very specific, but I'll just take it from the view of the Danish resistance.
Yes, please do.
Because, because it was the resistance, as I said, was pressed in the defensive, and many activities were being scaled down or altogether abandoned because the Germans were so successful in this period of controlling and using informants. So two air raids were implemented to try to disrupt Gestapo activities, and the one at the Aarhus air raid, the bombing at Aarhus University, conducted by mosquitoes, as you see in the picture, who flew in treetop level and persistent bombed these buildings in the next largest city in Denmark, my alma mater. I went by the memorial plaque every day for 5 years. So this is a big deal in Denmark, this precision bombing. And I must say, it was not all bombs did not hit exactly. There were casualties, but it was I'll come back to it. It was a very successful raid. And I think, Paul, we also must remember a raid which built on the British success in bombing the Amiens prison and the Oslo air raid a couple of years before. So the Mosquito was this tool of precision bombing, which aided resistant movements when the Gestapo got too close, something like that. So this is the Danish version of it. I think the more tragic example is Operation Carthage, when the RAF bombs the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen at Husted. And here one of the mosquitoes unfortunately hits a mast at the railroad area in Copenhagen. It goes down, and then the trouble is that in the area it has gone down. It's quite close to a school, and the next wave bombs this school. So there is a great loss of life, and especially children. But if we take them together, you see the Germans come out quite badly, but also in Operation Carthage, a great many Danish civilians are killed, especially, as I said, children. But the fact is that the RAF is able to bomb Gestapo headquarters, first in Aarhus, then in Copenhagen. And I should also say there is, another raid which is a bit overlooked, but the Gestapo headquarters in Odense, third largest city in Denmark at the island of Fyn, is also bombed in April 1944. So every one of the main Gestapo headquarters in the larger towns in Denmark is bombed in this period of the war, and it's of course very important for the resistance because it gives the Danish resistance a breathing space, and of course it also comes with the price, as you see, great deal of loss of life and property. But I think one of the indirect consequences of these raids is also that the Danish population and the Germans, of course, are witnessing that the Allied zone of operations is now covering Denmark and Danish territory. Yeah. So one could say, and I know this, you should be careful, that war has come to Denmark. And again, it's sporadic. It's very few places, but it's there. And I think the point is worth emphasizing, because if you put it into contrast with the policy of collaboration in 1940 to 1943, this didn't happen. So Denmark has in some way gone full circle from collaborating with the Germans to now being an active part of an active war zone. Again, very small scale, maybe in a scale many would say is not war, it's precision bombing, but in the Danish context, I think it's quite important. And it's something that Danish resistance and the S.O.E. also see as a sign that Denmark is now a part of the Allied camp. The Danish resistance, because it is coordinating its activities with the S.O.E., it's receiving its arms or part of its arms from the S.O.E. It's also part of the Allied cause. And this is, I think, quite an important point, especially for the period after the war, but also for the way Danes understand the World War and the occupation today. Okay. Another point which underlines the fact that Denmark is not collaborating anymore, that Danish society is in some ways being pressed by the war, is the flurry of activity and sabotage in 1944 and onwards. And I think we should also remember that the larger part, I think 90% of the S.O.E. airdrops into Denmark, I think it's 800 tons or so in total. Again, it's not much, but it's there. And just to get the numbers straight, the total number of S.O.E. operatives in Denmark, I think it's 53. So that's not an army. That's a smaller, half a company of operators who act as instructors, radio men, and such. So the nerve center of part of the resistance, one could argue, S.O.E. becomes during 1943, 1944. But it enables the Danish resistance to conduct an active campaign of sabotage. And again, you should not imagine cities burning and Germans losing control of large swathes of territory in Denmark. This is not the Polish underground army. But you should imagine railroads being cut at a regular basis, and as the other picture, German, Danish, Nazis, German sympathizers and such being shot. And again, we are not in the thousands, we are in the hundreds or maybe even only at 100 or so people. But the society as a whole is feeling the impact of the resistance movement, and especially Danes who had chosen the side of the Germans are fair game in this period in time. And the Germans react with a campaign of terror. And I know I say this a lot, but I must stress, you must not imagine again Polish circumstances or anything like that. But the Germans employ Danish Nazis, veterans from the Eastern Front. As I said before, Danes who had fought for the Waffen SS came back to Denmark, and were some of them then employed in this counterintelligence operations against the S.O.E. or against the resistance. And they attack civilians. Let's say their campaign is built upon when there is an act of resistance, then there will be an act of counter-terror, and the object being to scare the Danish population into forcing the Danish resistance not to do these acts of sabotage. So both parties are then engaged in a cat and mouse fight, where the Germans during 1943, 1944, as I said, have the upper hand. But the bombings, which we talked about before, are a disrupting factor for the Gestapo activities, but never something which destroys the Gestapo's ability to actively disturb the resistance movement in Denmark. And I think we also should bear in mind that resistance in Denmark takes on a bit of another form during the during the spring of 1944. And that is because, well, picture of the big history, the tides of the war have changed. Now it's time for an Allied army to land back on continental Europe. And in this work, the preparation for the Allied comeback is the main work of the S.O.E. in all of occupied Europe. In Denmark, there's a chain of leadership. The last one we saw, Moose, he returns to Great Britain, and then this man called Ole Lippmann comes in. He's a gifted organizer. He's also sent from London because the S.O.E. in London now has the ambition to not just win the war, or not lose the war, disturb the Germans, but also win the peace. And as I said before, build these underground armies, this underground army in Denmark, which can act as some sort of stabilizing factor if and when German control on Denmark collapse. And here I think we have a good example of S.O.E. activities as being both military to aid an Allied invasion of Europe, in this case, if and when they invaded the Danish territory, but also an S.O.E. being an instrument of British foreign policy to tie Denmark to Britain after the war, and to secure British interest in the North Sea and the Baltic. So these points are essential to understand the way the S.O.E. in the guise of Lippmann here tries to unite different strands of the Danish resistance movement, so there is not this, let's say, disagreement or fear of civil strife, civil war. Again, it is a fear that the S.O.E. has on a worldwide or maybe European scale, with good reason in Greece and Yugoslavia and so forth. But in Denmark, it's never a reality.
And thank you for reminding us of that, because I think a lot of us have this vision of the S.O.E., the blowing things up and setting Europe ablaze part of it, the setting up of the resistance. But of course, as people like Phil Craig, who was on my channel a few weeks ago, by 1945, they're looking at the political situation in Burma, Myanmar, what's going to be happening in Indochina in the future. So there's almost like a political movement becomes in SOE, and that they're anticipating the end of the war, and they're thinking about the maps, how the maps will be decided, how the borders will be decided, and exactly what will happen with the various European empires at the end of the war. So it's we kind of forget that SOE was essentially a government organization that is also working for the government with long-term visions beyond just the setting Europe ablaze. So thank you for reminding us of
no
that.
problem. And in a Danish context, this is very much the goal of the SOE. And I think also when we talk about the SOE, it is a very important factor when it comes to the liberation in Denmark. But you must remember German forces surrender the 4th of May 1945, and then there are joyous scenes of celebrating the liberation in Denmark, and the SOE then becomes a bit of a redundant force when you look at it from the outside in. But the I think important story here is that the SOE, as we said, served to fuse together the resistance in Denmark. So there was no civil strife or anything like that during this troubled time or tumultuous time after during the liberation. And this also could be, well, I think, Paul, a opportunity to see what is the SOE in a broader context. And if you see in the Danish context, many would say the SOE was part of the larger resistance and was able to give Denmark some sort of, national pride, or a point which we can see ourselves in. But as you see, famous British historian John Keegan, he's not so, he was not so thrilled about the SOE, as he put it as an inefficient organization, and he was also, that's in another quote, prone to say that the SOE was state-sponsored terrorism, or something like that. So Keegan sees a waste of resources and maybe also some sort of instrument which, let's say, set Europe ablaze. Yes, but what it set ablaze was existing political polarization and infighting, which plagued Europe and some European countries into the 60s and 70s. And the other point, of course, from Max Hastings is, I think, something which many Danish historians who subscribe to the consensus view see, that the SOE and the secret war was something more psychological and symbolic, and something which served to, well, be some sort of national reference point. And in the case of Denmark, it is, I think it's safe to say, something which even today many Danish politicians use when they when we commemorate World War II and the sacrifices. We start with the few, the resistance fighters, and the courage and the sacrifice, and then we try to explain to ourselves how they became, let's say, our moral conscience, because after the war, nobody talked about the policy of collaboration. Everybody suddenly was part of the resistance or were defying the Nazis in some way during the occupation. So, as you see, this is a very controversial subject, and I hope I haven't offended anyone out there. It was not my intention, but in Denmark, this is very emotional, and a great many Danes have family which were active resistors, and when they hear that the Danish resistance was maybe more symbolic than it was actually of military value, a point Keegan, I think, would agree on, then tempers often get a bit heated, because my granddaddy or such, he risked his life, and these small stories, when they meet big history, as I said a couple of times during this interview, well, it's hard to to understand the past when you have a certain vision of the past. And this, of course, is the business of historians in every field of history. But it becomes very real and very near when we talk about World War II and the occupation of in Denmark.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just for those out there who has the ability to read Danish or maybe English, some reading, I should stress these are older works. There are a great deal of newer, which you may find more enlightened, but these are maybe more standard works. And this is my book about
shameless plug for your own work. I like your style, sir.
Well, as the S.O.E would say, who dares?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the SAS, of course. So, thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Well, we have a few questions for you, which we'll try and... So, Pete asked very early on about, did the Danish citizens graffiti V for victory at all, like the Dutch did? But beyond that, was there a particular Danish way that you could sort of say to your Danish friends that you were, of the spirit of resistance? Was there anything that's particularly unique to Denmark?
There were a couple of defined acts. The RAF logo, which the RAF has on those planes. I can't remember.
Yep.
Danish young women, they knitted hats and such with that symbol, and to provoke the Germans and signal defiance. And another, I think, very Danish defined activity was to meet in large gatherings and sing traditional Danish songs. This might sound a bit strange, but it shows some form of, let's say, patriotism and
solidarity, defiance, togetherness.
Exactly.
It's that, as we said, it's that resistance comes in all forms, and singing patriotic songs is a form of resistance. Thank you for that. So did Danish workers help build the Atlantic Wall, and if yes, was there sabotage of any kind?
Well, that is one of the traditional questions. Not questions, but let's say myths in Denmark. I know a lot of people whose grandparents helped to build German bunkers and cannon positions and all that, and then they put sugar in the concrete or something like that. And I don't know if it's actually true. Maybe some of them did. I think sugar was something of a resource during the war.
I'm going to go out on the limb and say it's bollocks. It gets talked about in France as well. The amount of sugar you would need to put in concrete to make a discernible difference to its strength is beyond the amount of sugar that your average French or Danish or any other worker could slip into work with a bag of sugar down in your underwear and then tip it into I think it's one of those. It's done the rounds. This story of my grandfather used to put sugar or salt in the fuel tanks.
Yeah. I think the way, it's not the proudest moment maybe when you look back, but the Danish population actually paid for the German fortifications on the Atlantic Wall, as well did the Norwegian and French, because the Germans just stole the money. But Danish workers built it, of course, and they are, if you want to visit, many of them stands there today in picturesque environment. But they must have wondered why they did it. Sometimes when you visit these places, they lie on a site where I think nobody in their right mind, military mind, would ever contemplate of invading. But it's also a glimpse, I think, or view into the way the German occupation forces worked, not just in Germany, but in all of Northwestern Europe, where the Kriegsmarine had an ambition of building, and the Luftwaffe, and they built a lot, but I don't know if they had any military value. That could be discussed, I think.
Okay, thank you. John asked, was there an equivalent of the networks in France and Belgium to handle downed airmen?
Yes.
I mean, we talked with Tim Brady a couple of weeks ago about the evacuation of Denmark's Jews, which was sort of you could call it a network that's sort of part of the resistance, but it's also a sort of a humanitarian effort. So is there one to look after pilots?
Well, there isn't any Shetland bus service or something like that, in the northern part of Norway. But there was a network where you could smuggle things to and from Sweden. But the point was the trouble was that you had to have some sort of errand if you want to travel with the official way to Sweden. But you must remember, if you manage to get to Copenhagen or the northern coast of this part of Denmark, then it's not very far to Sweden. So an established network did exist, and down there, and there are quite a lot of instances of these men being ferried across Denmark and then to Sweden. But of the down there, and I know a lot of them are unfortunately captured by the Germans, and a larger part of them are so close to Sweden that they are interned in Sweden during the war. But there is a network, but I must admit, how many pilots they succeed in getting to Sweden, I don't know.
Okay, well, another one to add to the list of things to research in the future.
Yeah.
So another question from John, and you talked about the big change after the events of 1943 and Torch and Stalingrad and Kursk and what have you. But I'm assuming the Germans started taking more resources away in the middle of the war because the food was becoming an issue. They were losing. They were being pushed out of the Soviet Union. They've still got massive armies. So I'm assuming they're cranking up how much butter they need, how much raw materials they're taking, and that's going to have an effect on the Danish mindset if you're just starting to take more.
It's a very good question, and one would assume that the Germans took what they needed and used a heavy hand in taking it. But the fact is that the German head figures in Denmark actually, during the whole war, tries to, let's say, take the brunt of the demands Hitler and the German High Command makes on the occupied territories. So there is this, let's say, competition between Werner Best, the German top figure in Denmark, who on one hand wishes to accommodate the wishes from Berlin of more food, more resources, but on the other hand knows that if he pushes Denmark too hard, then resistance or defiance. And defiance here could be that the harvest won't yield as much as you need. So he also needs some form of cooperation from the Danish population, and this cooperation he gets of not pushing too hard in the way he suppresses resistance or orders executions or something like that. So again, it's this double face of the German resistance. The German occupying powers in Denmark, and again a quite unique history. When it comes down to the occupied European countries. So yes, the Germans are asking a lot of resources, especially food resources from Denmark, but they always have to bear in mind that it's a dialogue of some with Danish officials, and these officials again know that the only way of getting farmers and such to produce anything is to give them opportunities. So it's, let's say, it's a kind of a strange dance in the middle of an occupation.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, we're hoping to have some kind of show in the future about Germany's economic policies or Denmark's economic policies with regards to occupation sometime in the future. A question from 3X. Did Denmark get any part of the US Marshall aid post-war? Yes. You said there wasn't a huge amount of destruction in Denmark, perhaps compared to other countries, but there is a Marshall Plan. There is an idea to rebuild Europe. Did it get any aid?
Yes, very much. And Denmark was very fortunate because, as I said, not much destruction, if any, but a production apparatus which was unmodernized, and old production methods left Denmark in a quite of a sticky position in the immediate after-war period. So there was rationing, and there were not many machines and such. And the martial aid was crucial in rebuilding Danish economy and rebuilding Danish society, and also, of course, to tie Denmark. Crucial, I don't know, but some historians would argue, including myself, that it was crucial, important to tie Denmark to the U.S. British world order. U.S. Right. Of course, in the immediate after-war period and first Cold War phase.
Because that's, I mean, we didn't touch on that, but history tells us that essentially the smaller the country, the less bargaining you have at the end of the war when it comes to treaties and conferences, things like that. And everybody wants, in some ways, to have a seat at that table.
Yeah.
And you know, Denmark, not a big place, but you don't want to be just left aside, you know, because huge, great decisions are being made. We look what happened to poor old Poland, where the British and the Allies basically shafted them, which was a tragedy. But yeah, you can understand why Denmark is wanting to make sure it maintains a presence within Europe. It's not just, you know, insignificant little Denmark, who gives a shit. It's just a little, it's important. So one more question for you, Martin, but it's potentially a big one. It's from Dennis. How well is history known in Denmark? Because like, as I live in France, is that France has now absolutely come to terms with its World War II past. There will be documentaries about resistance fighters, and there'll be documentaries about Vichy and Pétain and the milice and things like that. And you know, you've told us through this presentation, there's the SS volunteers who are treated as traitors, and then there's the brave members of the S.O.E. There's the people we talked about with Tim who helped get out Denmark's Jews. So you have everything in your country, from absolute, you know, serving the Führer to giving your life in trying to defeat the Third Reich. So in terms of education, you kind of either have to tell it all or not tell it at all. So how does Denmark deal with the fact that there's both the good side and the bad side? Because you said about this, the image of the few is something that's used as in rhetoric by politicians, but how is it taught? Do you teach it all? Is basically what I'm going to say.
Yes, I teach it every year, and I do my utmost to include the policy of collaboration and the, you know, evacuation of the Jews and the motive behind these acts, and why the Germans behaved as they did in Denmark. And we also talk a lot about the Hvidsten group, the romantic part of it, you know, the ordinary people motivated by courage and patriotism, contra more, let's say, dark resistance figures. Well, dark is maybe a bad way of profiling them, but there are these figures who are employed in the last year or so of the war, whose main focus or purpose is to liquidate other Germans or Danish sympathizers and such. It's a very bloody business, and these men and women do not always know who they are liquidating and why. And maybe we are engaged in not so much a resistance act, but maybe a gangster act. And this is a dark game, and I try my best, and I know my colleagues as well, to explain why did we collaborate and what happened, but of course how we remember what happened. And I think that part of it is still very much alive in Danish history, how we remember this, and why, well, was the Danish population as a whole defined, or on the other hand, did it just duck down and hope that the Germans went away? And this I think is a question which has gotten a new relevance because of the war in Ukraine. Denmark and Danes are, again, for the first time in a couple of generations, fearing that war could come again to the Baltic or someplace near Denmark. and the interest in the Second World War has never died, of course, but has taken on a new urgency because of what's happening in Europe right now. And this is, of course, quite a tragic framework, but one that I think offers new perspectives.
Yeah. Well, I think, as you know, we will bring things to an end, but I think it's relatively easy to explain the very brave resistance people and the people who were imprisoned by the Gestapo and had to take. But that's bravery in its purest form. Yeah. And the horrible collaborators are very easy to explain as well. They're opportunists who you know. But it's the people in the middle. I with my French family, those people who were on farms, who the Germans came in and said, "You must billet 10 German soldiers in your place, and you must provide this amount of hay." And if you say yes, are you collaborating or are you just trying to exist? And I think that's the hardest bit to explain, because it's what most of us do most of the time. I see things in the world that I'm angry about, and I think, well, hang on, can I say something about that? Because I host a channel. Will I alienate half of my audience if I hoist my, things like Gaza, the West Bank, things like that? It's easy to just sort of bend with the breeze sometimes and just not say anything at all, so that you don't, piss people off and just hope, as you say, hope for a better future. Yeah. But some people actually fight for a better future, or fight for, but yes, it's us in the middle that are hard to explain. But we will bring things in. Martin, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I feel I'm going to invite you to come back and elaborate on this, because I think there's other aspects that we can knuckle down on. And I think your honesty with is refreshing at looking at Denmark from a very balanced, nuanced point of view, and saying there's good and bad, and and sometimes that it's you don't have to kind of come down on one side or other. You said there's the two schools of thought about Denmark's decision. It's possible to not really side with one or other. Well, I know it's complicated. The truth is in the middle somewhere, as it often is. So I will bring you back. But folks, we are an hour. We're an hour early today. Tomorrow we're 2 hours early. As always, click like and subscribe. Buy my guests' books. Go to their websites. Thank everybody for your fantastic questions. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member, and I will see you all tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV, saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers. Thank you, Martin. Bye.
Bye-bye.